Good evening, and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's program tonight in the Community Center. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and tonight we are thrilled to host Kim Stanley Robinson. He is widely recognized as one of the foremost living writers of science fiction today, and you will, of course, if you've read his books, you know why. He has published 22 novels, and they've been translated into 24 different languages, including Croatian, Kim, in case you didn't know. So these books, some of them are the Mars Trilogy, New York 2140, Aurora, and The Ministry for the Future, which is his latest book, and he'll be talking about some of the ideas and themes from that book tonight. That book, even though it shows some of the difficulties that we're going to experience because the climate crisis has not been dealt with in a timely way, it also shows a vision and what's possible, which he will also talk about tonight. Many of Robinson's novels have ecological, cultural, and political themes and feature scientists who are heroes. Imagine that, especially in our political climate today. Robinson has won numerous awards, including the Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Awards, to name just a few. In addition to mountain climbing and having a deep reverence for nature, Robinson also holds a PhD in English literature from UC San Diego and has taught at UC Davis. And one of my favorite quotes about his work comes from New York Times columnist Ezra Klein. He writes this of Ministry for the Future, quote, "If I could get policymakers and citizens everywhere to read just one book this year, it would be Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future." So with that laudatory quote, please help me welcome Kim Stanley Robinson.
Well, thank you, Georgia, for that kind introduction, and pleasure to speak to you tonight. Well, things are going so well in the country that I thought I needed to, bring us down a little bit with some truly bad news, to reorient ourselves to reality. And because as a science fiction writer, I like to think that I'm doing something reality-based. And if you start your imaginings of what the future could be from a distorted or inaccurate portrait of the present, then you very quickly get sucked into a world of fantasy. And so I like science fiction. I don't like fantasy. It's not exactly the narcissism of small differences. It's a real thing. And so I want to talk to you for about 40 minutes, and then we'll do question and answer. Right. The situation, let's say that we're in a carbon dioxide overshoot, and it will last for a century at least. We're putting about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere per year, and that adds up to about 4 parts per million per year. And that number has not come down fast enough. And quite a while ago, Wally Brooker, a climate scientist, calculated that before humanity crashed the biosphere by heating it up too much and creating runaway greenhouse effects, that we could burn about 500 gigatons more, 500 billion tons more. And at 40 a year, you can work that out, probably faster than I can, but that was a while ago. And it hasn't really slowed down yet, despite everything that's happened. So 500 gigatons we can burn, and then we really ought to be done with it. We ought to be using nothing but clean energy to power civilization itself. There's been about 3,500 gigatons located of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, underground around the world. And about 70% of that is owned by nation states. So it's not Exxon and Shell and BP, those exist, but it's the national companies of what can be called the petrostates that are owners of the 3,500 gigatons, which they have as assets on their books already and plan to sell and burn. Those very same nations have also signed the Paris Agreement of 2015 and have been having COPs ever since to talk about how to reduce fossil fuel emissions. But the stranded assets, the 3,000 gigatons of fossil fuels that are in the ground, mostly owned by nation states, if they stay stranded, those nation states will go bankrupt because they're called petrostates because more than 50%, and often it's 70 to 80% of their government's income comes from selling and then burning fossil fuels. These nations are caught in a double bind. And some of them you think of as kleptoparasites or autocratic governments of one sort or another, failed states, or places where fossil fuels are well known to be the curse on the nations that actually happen to have them, because at that point you've got a corrupt leadership that steals all the funds, and then the people that live there get all of the damage from the pollution and everything else and none of the benefits. But on the other hand, these petrostates are doing their best with the resources they have, and the money that they take in goes to teachers, police, airports, roads, and so on. So without that income, a failed state, we have some, Somalia, southern Sudan, to a certain extent, Syria. And if countries like Nigeria, Venezuela, South Africa, Angola, Colombia, Australia, there are petrostates that are perhaps more robust in that they're richer in other ways. But for many a nation, and maybe 2 billion people out of the 8 billion people are living in petrostates that essentially have signed their own financial death warrant, and therefore, of course, are not going to actually abide by the promises that they've made at the Paris Agreement. Just this week, they all reported that they were late, except for a couple of nations. There are always some exceptions. Sometimes they're surprising, the exceptions. Other times it's just as clear as can be that they're behaving the way they always have. But diplomats gather at the COP meetings every November around the world. This November in Belém, Brazil. Last November in Baku, Azerbaijan. It goes on and on. But the promises made there by the diplomats from these nation states, using a consensus model, which means that every single nation has to sign off on the final statement, have been, the statements are watered down. They're very slow to make any progress, but the Paris Agreement itself insists that at every year's meeting, they make some progress. They up their promises. They ratchet the force of the agreement itself. It's written into it. They do their best, and they come up with something that gets widely scoffed at, and yet is not inconsiderable. A loss and damage fund to help the developing countries hammered by climate change disasters. And then in this most recent one, $300 billion promised to the loss and damage fund. As inadequate as that is, it is their best attempt to make that ratcheting of a promise every year that makes things a little better at these meetings. So with the best will in the world, when they go back home, there are other government officials back in their countries saying, you got to be kidding me. We're not going to do that. We have other priorities here. And indeed, the discrepancy is growing between what the world community and the nation state system has promised us we would do about climate change and reducing fossil fuel emissions and what we are actually doing. And of course, the United States is a spectacular, explosive example of how bad they can get. The U.S. was never a leader on these climate issues, but it, of course, being one of the biggest economies on Earth and certainly the aging superpower since the end of the Cold War, it's bad if the leading nation and the second largest emitter of fossil fuels not only backs out of the system, but does its damnedest to wreck everything having to do with confronting this emergency. It's not just sticking your head in the ground in ostrich style, which is a kind of a cliche of we're going to ignore this problem and pretend it doesn't exist. That's true, but there's also the Götterdämmerung, that if we have to change or wreck the world, we'll wreck the world. We want it to go down. in a kind of a death cult response, that if I have to go down, the world goes down with me. A malignant narcissism that I would say is not characteristic of the American attitude of the entire American people. I'll talk about that more later. But the current leadership, yes. So, the carbon dioxide overshoot, say that when the Industrial Revolution began, it was at 280 parts per million. And it had been cycling between 280 parts per million and 350 parts per million for about 1,000,000 years. It probably has to do with the orbit of the Earth going more circular and then more elliptical over a pattern that is as clean as the blades on a saw, back and forth for 1,000,000 years back. And I would just want to point out that we're kind of lucky. It's an accident of cosmic history that the Industrial Revolution began at when we were at 280. If it had begun when we were at 350 in the cycle, one can imagine where we would be now. But it began at 280. Now it's at about 420. We're going to have to bring it down. And yet, we're not. And indeed, there's a rather ferocious resistance from the fossil fuel industries of the companies, but also the nation states, to keep burning fossil fuels in a way that is going to push us into such dangerous warming that A, people will die, like at the beginning of my novel Ministry for the Future, from wet bulb events of heat and humidity combined. But B, we might release a whole lot of carbon and methane that are sequestered in the Earth right now, released to the atmosphere, would double down on what we've put there, runaway greenhouse effect, to what the geologists, the paleoclimatologists call hothouse Earth, where there's no ice on the planet. And when there's no ice on the planet, sea level is about 220 feet higher than it is now. I wouldn't be surprised if we would be underwater right here, because mostly these Northern California cities, Napa, Sonoma, are on rivers that came up from the North Bay. And we might not be that high here. I really don't know. But let's just say this. We want the ice on the planet to stay there. And eventually I'm going to get my talk to that point. People are talking about what do we do if we go into carbon dioxide overshoot, which we've already begun. I'm going to focus in on this while also wanting to acknowledge that this is one part of a more general polycrisis having to do with land use, having to do with wild creatures, having to do with a mass extinction event, sixth in Earth's history. And obviously the first one started by human beings and their activities. We've started it. We could still pull out of it. And I want to hold on to that thought, because I'm going to go deeper and darker before I begin to pull back up. Well, no, that's not really true. Maybe I've gotten to the low point here. I want to talk about the people who are saying, what can we do to get ourselves through this crisis century, this polycrisis? And I want to frame it around this notion of the word geoengineering. Now, many of you, when you hear that word, you'll think, these are bad ideas brought up by bad people to get away with bad things they did in the past so that they can continue to do bad things in the future. Geoengineering. In certain mental dictionaries, that's its definition. Well, it sounds bad. Of course. But most of the people working on these ideas are well-meaning people, often scientists, who are thinking, if we have too much CO2 in the atmosphere and we are near the slippery slope of starting a runaway greenhouse effect that we ourselves as human beings on this planet could not stop even if we wanted to. If it was the total human project to restore the climate, if we were too far down the runaway greenhouse effect, we would not have the physical powers to do it. It really would be out of control at that moment. And there's a great phrase by John Maynard Keynes, who is really the economist of our time, come back again, very helpful, useful thinker. Anything that we have to do, we can afford to do. But he was talking about depressions, employment problems, winning a war. Anything we have to do, we can afford to do. And the government makes money up and then spends it in the right ways. It's Keynesianism, really. But he wasn't talking about runaway greenhouse effects. That would be something that we have to do, we would want to do. We couldn't afford to do it because we couldn't do it at all. This is the point. We don't want to get to that situation. And I'm not saying we're really close to it, but I'll say this: we don't know how close to it we are. Right now, the temperature on this planet is about a half degree Celsius higher than any of the climatologists can explain. El Nino doesn't explain it. The end of El Nino, they're all looking at it. They talk about it in terms that are mostly British. It's gobsmacking, it's astonishing, etc. If it can't be explained, has the runaway greenhouse effect, the release of carbon from the tundra of the north, the release of methane from frozen methane hydrates in the ocean, has that begun yet? Well, it's a mystery. James Hansen has a great story there, which is this: we cleaned up container ship fuel. This was the worst diesel fuel, bunker fuel. The International Maritime Organization said to all the shipping industries of the world, clean up your fuel, or else you don't get license from us. Strangely, it worked. We cleaned up diesel fuel. That took particulates out of the atmosphere that were acting just like geoengineering sulfur dioxide particles. We cleaned up the air, the earth heated up. Now, cleaning up that air in those ways was a good thing because it was poisonous. On the other hand, it let more heat into the Earth system by not bouncing that light away. This is the complicated situation that we're in here, where even the good things that we do may be problematical in other side effects that we don't want. That's why I want us to all reconsider geoengineering in a couple ways. One, the word is too big and broad. It's talking about at least a dozen, perhaps 20 different processes that are disparate in their methods, in their global effects, in their dangers, in their unintended side effect probabilities or possibilities, and even in what they're trying to do. So I want to untangle that. A quick taxonomy here. The first one is simply reducing emissions, of keeping it in the ground, of not burning the fossil fuels in the first place. When you take assets like that and you strand them, that is a deliberate act of geoengineering. And it is also the sine qua non, which is without this, nothing. It's the necessity. It's the one that if we don't do it, all the rest of them that I list here are like patches. They're like Band-Aids on a cancer patient. They really are not enough. So reducing emissions and something like California fossil fuels reduction group, the various the fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty, and all efforts, including divestment from CalPERS and the various California state government and retirement organizations still investing in fossil fuels, they're all wrong on that. They're all making a bad mistake. They're all ignoring reality and acting as if the biophysical reality of this planet is somehow negotiable or fungible or can be bought off, none of which is true. Reality bites. That's what's going to get the current administration, by the way. Once you go off into a fantasy, either friendly or psychotic, reality eventually bites and you're drawn back into the real world, maybe by a smack in the face, maybe by a crash of reality into your face. In some cases, one hopes so. So that's the first, emissions reduction, the sine qua non. Secondly, carbon drawdown. No, second is carbon capture. You burn the carbon, but you capture the CO2 as it's being released. Before it gets to the atmosphere, you bury it, you store it somewhere. So CCS, carbon capture storage. Well, it's not a bad idea if you could make it work and if you would pay for it. It's not entirely impossible. It's not a physical impossibility. It's a financial difficulty. The two are very different. And there are also various ways of carbon capture that seem interesting that we could, say you had a coal burning plant and it was creating electricity that is very useful, but it's burning coal. And you decommission it. Of course, that's the best thing to do. You can't burn that coal. But that plant sits there and is connected to the grid, and it could make electricity if you could turn those turbines, which needs heat to boil the water. Well, people are saying if there was a small nuclear plant in there, a thorium reactor, something like what the Navy puts in their submarines, and placed into every coal burning plant, replacing the coal with nuclear power, you would have clean energy and it would still connect to the grid. You wouldn't have to rebuild all that stuff. This is maybe put in that category, carbon capture storage. It has to be on the table. Let's keep open to everything at this point. So then the third is carbon drawdown. That CO2 in the atmosphere, let's bring it back down. Good idea. I think a civilizational project. Now, when 40 billion tons a year are being put up into the atmosphere, like a sewage system that is missing, so the sewage goes up and poisons everybody, but it's invisible in the air, drawing it back down at any kind of a rate commensurate with what the entirety of humanity is putting up there is, of course, difficult. So carbon drawdown, first you have to acknowledge no one method will be enough. And in fact, all the methods together might not equal 40 billion tons a year. Nevertheless, they all need to be done. We need to get down from 420, 425. We maybe need to get down to, I've been saying we need to get back down to 350 because that's what the Earth has been used to as its upper limit. Now I'm thinking, let's just take it 1 ton at a time. If the amount of CO2 is going down in the atmosphere, that's a good thing. Let's not set a goal that completely freaks us out. Every method should be used. So the nature-based methods are much faster and scalable. Reforestation, regenerative agriculture, which is to say drawing carbon down into the soil while you're growing crops. And I looked it up, by the way, for this talk, because this is the first time I've given this talk, as you may be able to tell. Vineyards are actually stupendously good for carbon drawdown possibilities because you don't have tillage, because you do want your soil enriched, because in general, all the methods by which the agricultural communities of the world have talked about drawing carbon back down into the soil are quite appropriate for vineyards. So driving over here today, I was thinking, aha, Sonoma County could actually do a very hefty carbon drawdown work by regenerative agriculture. Then also the ocean, people talk about kelp beds and seagrass, growing more of it, bringing it out, sequestering it or using it. There are mineral methods, certain rocks like basalt or olivine. When you crush them into gravel and put them in the soil, they weather, they draw down carbon, they turn into a different mineral. Olivine on beaches, the sand made of olivine would quickly draw carbon into it and become a different kind of mineral. Mineralization, it stays around a long time. And then lastly, one that's more famous, direct air capture. You make a machine like a vacuum cleaner, and it sucks through and the carbon dioxide is taken out of it, and you've got a whole lot of frozen CO2 as dry ice or whatever, even just compressed, and then pumped deep under the ground. In Iceland, they put it right down into the rift that made the Atlantic. In other places, there are many places to put it, okay? But there aren't many machines doing it. And some people talk about building enough direct air capture machines to do it would be like the auto industry. You would need that many machines. Well, that many machines requires a whole lot of steel, which is a carbon heavy burn. In other words, direct air capture, as interesting as it is not the way that's going to work as the only way. And so I just list it as one amongst the many other things that will be carbon drawdown. And again, I want to emphasize this point. You don't have to set 350 parts per million as a goal and then say, oh my God, we could never do that. You just want to say, we want to start going down again. Create a margin of safety between us and a runaway event. And this will be a centuries-long project. Okay, fourth category, and there's where it gets to a place that perhaps is a little more well-known. Cooling the planet down. So say you got a patient and they're dying of a disease and they got a fever so high that they might die of the fever before the disease gets them. You got to cool them down first, and then you got to try to solve the underlying disease. This is a good analogy for that category of geoengineering that is talking about cooling the planet. The main one is called solar radiation management, SRM. They give it that name so that people won't keep calling it geoengineering and thinking, oh my God, what a bad idea. Well, casting a whole bunch of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where it would go everywhere on Earth and infect every person's lives, it's not clear that's a great idea, but it is clear that it would work, that humans could do it. We could imitate a Pinatubo eruption that happened in Pinatubo in 1991 in the Philippines, put about that much sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere without the dirt and dust that goes with volcanic eruptions. And so It wouldn't make the skies white, but it would reflect a lot of sunlight back out into space, enough to cool the planet for about 5 years, for about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. Should we do that once and see if we can save people from dying in the tropics and see how it works and see if it happens to wreck the monsoon, which is the main danger? Well, I don't want to answer that. Nobody wants to answer that. It's a hot potato. UN doesn't want to talk about it. The governance issues are extremely problematic. Would this world ever agree, oh, yeah, let's throw up however many billions of tons of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere and see if that helps? There are people in Pakistan, when they hear about this plan, they say, please do it now. But everybody else on the planet is going, you got to be kidding me. But it's out there, okay, because we could do it. And we have very little leverage. There's very few things that we could do with that many effects. Another cooling method is called marine layer cloud brightening. This would be the container ships putting up some particulates, again, like we used to do by accident, but this time on purpose with something more benign, that would brighten the marine layer clouds and bounce some sunlight back into space and cool it down. Thickening the Arctic sea ice so that it doesn't melt, and so we still have the albedo of the Arctic Ocean. This is also cooling the planet in a way. Anything that increases albedo, even to white roofs in cities or gigantic sheets of white blanket covering the Sahara. I mean, some of these ideas are quite implausible, you might say, but they're out there. And one of them, if the Arctic Ocean does become open water, which is quickly on its way to in the summers, we are in a terrible runaway situation because more heat will dance into that ocean, heat that ocean more, less ice, more water, more heat, and the whole planet gets cooked. So keeping albedo in the Arctic is one of these cooling the planet methods. And that leads me to, since it's talking about Arctic ice, to the next category, which would be ice preservation. And here, for those of you who have read my Ministry for the Future, you might remember an Antarctic strand. People were down there trying to suck water out from under the big ice sheets in order to slow them down, to keep them in place so that they don't drift off into the ocean and raise sea level. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly unstable, and it's the one that's most likely to come off first because the land under West Antarctica is actually lower than sea level. And it's only the weight of that mass of ice that keeps it thumped down onto a bottom that in some cases is 1,000 feet below sea level. If that comes off, sea level goes up about 7 meters, about 25 feet. That's not the ice-free planet. That's still a human catastrophe of stupendous proportions. Think of all your favorite coastal cities: New York, London, Tokyo, Singapore, Jakarta, St. Petersburg, Helsinki, coastal cities. Think of it. It goes on and on and on. San Francisco jumps out of the ocean quite quickly, but on the other hand, the rest of the Bay Area. Anyway, you get the picture. We don't want 7 meters of sea level rise. If we could stabilize those ice sheets in Western Antarctica by sucking the water out from under them or by freezing the bottom of the glacier to the rock under it by way of essentially just an extensive version of the heat pump that is hopefully in all of our homes. You take the heat that is down there on the bottom, that is water under the glacier. The mid-glacier is ice that's about 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. That's how cold Antarctica is. You transfer that heat, that cold, down to the bottom, freeze the ice to the rock itself. The ice stays in place. And here's what I want to add before I move on. There's a natural precedent for that. There was an ice stream going gangbusters into the Antarctic Ocean, and about 150 years ago or more, a little more, it stopped. Why? Well, because a water stream underneath it, running underneath it, got diverted, as in oxbow fashion in the Mississippi. Went elsewhere, the ice bumped down. It's called the KAM ice stream, K-A-M-B. This is a natural precedent that humans might be able to imitate artificially. We get through the ice all the time now. It's not really drilling, it's melting, but the techniques for getting through the Antarctic ice are well established. Might be done. I'm working with a group that I enjoy thoroughly: glaciologists, technical people, interested parties, retired people who want to try to save the world. It's a good group. They would like to do some experiments to see what happens when they try it. Not in Antarctica, because that is one heck of a logistical challenge and would require the navies of the world, an aircraft carrier, the U.S. Navy aircraft carrier, as a base offshore from the Thwaites Glacier. Quite complicated, but on the other hand, maybe not impossible if you want to save sea levels. The experiments might happen in Alaska or in Iceland or in Svalbard. So, how am I doing? I'm doing pretty well here. Whew. How do we pay for all this? It's expensive. Most of it is not for profit. Possibly, you could treat it like national defense, where the government pays for it, but they pay private contractors that do make a profit to do it. So there are financial models for this. But obviously, in this world, where we can't even find that $300 billion for loss and damage, the kind of money that it would take. Well, here's the two expensive items. Remember those petrostates? They need help to actually keep it in the ground so they don't become failed states. Colombia, they signed the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty. They said, we're not going to burn any more fossil fuels. Colombia was the fifth biggest coal producer on this planet as nation states go. They said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We want to be a good world citizen, and so we need some help. They did not get any help. This is a gigantic failure, both private and public. This is where well, let's not even go there, but there's many, many ways in which Colombia, for what they offered to do, for the treaty that they signed, they ought to immediately have gotten assistance. And when they didn't, now, of course, that government that made that brave gesture is in political trouble at home. So we are blowing it, but the money is there. I say that because during the pandemic, about $15 trillion was cooked up almost instantaneously to keep a depression from happening. During the 2008 crisis, about $5 trillion was created. Quantitative easing is a real thing. Quickly, the central banks can make money. And so a carbon quantitative easing program that essentially the central banks agree to fill that loss and damage fund or to support that fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty by actual funds at a rate of about $1 trillion or $2 trillion per year. It would not be inflationary. We saw that because of the experiences of our previous quantitative easing. And it would help a lot if that money was generated and paid first for decarbonization, for all green projects, the other ones that I'm skipping on, like wildlife protection. I'm focusing on this just to try to keep a focus. And also because I think it's also the sine qua non. If we don't deal with this, all the other good things that we're doing are going to be pressured to the point of possible collapse. So the International Monetary Fund, along with the World Bank, they were generally regarded as part of the Washington Consensus, an instrument of American financial power in the world. The dollar is the imperial coin on this planet, the US dollar, and keeping it that way has been a project of the American government since the end of the Cold War, if not the end of World War II at Bretton Woods. Now, with that kind of money backing the International Monetary Fund, they have a program now. They call it Special Drawing Rights. I think they gave it that vague title so that nobody would really pay attention to it or understand it, because they're making loans to countries that are distressed financially that the countries don't have to pay back. Well, usually we don't call that a loan. So they're special drawing rights. And about $500 billion have been distributed and have helped countries. This is a program the IMF cooked up somewhat under the radar because there are certain people in Washington, D.C. who, if they understood it, would of course want to smash it because it's so helpful to people. That program itself is already a model for the kind of quantitative easing or the kind of distribution of government funds into other government funds that would then go to private people, businesses. And that would help us to pay for ourselves to do the necessary work. So I'm saying this, the financial instruments are there. In my novel, I called it the carbon coin. That is just a literary symbol. Even the description of it in the book, which is like way more detailed than most novelists would go into, that is still a very sketchy description of something that financial people have worked out in much more detail, which I find very comforting. And there's a network for greening the financial system, which is 90 of the biggest central banks trying to figure out ways to green the financial system. And so they are working on this issue. I can also add that the United States just left the network for greening the financial system. Of course, why wouldn't we? It's too helpful. So I can end with this, and which is good because I haven't gone over yet. I'm very pleased with myself. But I want to talk about Mondragon, Spain, and the cooperative movement because that's what Praxis Peace has been focusing on. That's how we met. And what I want to point out about it is the co-op movement worldwide, led by Mondragon because it's a town where a network of cooperatives, including credit and finance, are all owned by the employees themselves, have no shareholders that suck away the value of these companies. And the employees that own them at the end of the year, when the profits are touted up, because these companies do pretty well in the European market. They're the 10th biggest corporation in Spain, and they make a couple $1 billion a year. And then the employees decide 1/3 goes to the employees themselves, 1/3 goes to capital improvements, and 1/3 goes to charity projects that the employees themselves choose. Let's just change the whole world to that right now. We would be much better off all across the board. The shift from competition to cooperation that Georgia and Praxis are talking about are crucial. We are a cooperative species. We have taken over the world by way of cooperation as social primates. It is not true that we managed to do it by nature red in tooth and claw and by survival of the fittest. It's actually been a team project all along of rather weak and wimpy and unimpressive individual biological creatures teaming up to become a scary force, of course, dangerous as hell to all the other creatures, caused mass extinctions in the past of the megafauna. As soon as we got anywhere else in the world, the megafauna all died. Oh, what a coincidence. But they were really good food. So this cooperative species is good at cooperating. And here's the proof. There's 8 billion people there's 8 billion people on this planet. That's a technological, that's an absurdity. It's like a Tower of Babel, a tower of prostheses that we're standing on the top of, and all the prostheses actually have to work. And it's like one of those, some of you are old enough to remember the Ed Sullivan Show and spinning the plates on the top of the poles. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Civilization is like that. It's a gigantic collaboration that it works as well as it does. Of course it breaks down. Of course there are wars. Of course there's huge anger and resentment. It's not as if we're particularly sane, but we are cooperative. So in this particular crisis, if you focus on cooperative societies that already exist, and this is what's interesting about Georgia's process at Praxis, it's not a utopia that you make up and say, oh, it would be better if we did things this way. Well, of course. I mean, I've written 10 of them, but so what? What you want are real things that have been going on in the real world. Governance in Kerala, India, Mondragon's economic system. There are things that have been happening in the real world for a long time that if they were taken as models and scaled up, we could get through the crisis without a horrible crash. So 35 minutes and 47 seconds. I'm going to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Is this on? You can hear me? Okay, we're going to have Q&A now, so anyone who would like to come up and ask a question, this would be the time to do that.
Hi there. A big fan. And also our 17-year-old son is a big fan. We subjected him to the audiobook of Ministry for the Future on a long road trip, and he really ate it up. And he's going off to college next year, and what he wants to do is climate stuff, policy, economics, sociology, whatever. So he had a question, so I'm going to ask you his question. He is wondering if you have any thoughts about what he referred to as the trifecta that is what he sees in his future. the climate crisis, which you've been talking about, but also AI, and also what appears to be happening, which is just sort of a collapse of the functions of the U.S. government. Um, like the sort of collection of ideas that you've been working over in many books. Um, what are your thoughts about like adding the impacts of AI and whatever the heck is going on with our government right now on top of all those other great ideas?
Well, okay, this is some more plates to spin. But it's a good question because here's what I want to say. The climate crisis is the overdetermining situation. Althusser used to talk about this in France back in the 60s. There's overdeterminations that pressure everything else. So I would keep the focus on climate as it's the sine qua non. If we don't solve the climate crisis, the stuff we do elsewhere is going to crash under the weight of the climate catastrophe. Now, artificial intelligence, it's having a moment, right? But what does it actually do? Well, it's kind of impressive how well it can imitate us, including the hallucinations and the bullshitting and everything that AI does now. Large language models have topped out in what they can do. Large language models by themselves. Now, I have to admit, I'm quoting AI experts that I trust, because how do I know? But here's what I hear in the stories from the AI experts. Artificial general intelligence is going to need symbolic logic. It's going to need a sense of agency. It's going to need a sense of real world constraints and even of 3 dimensions. It's going to need more understanding than large language models have, which are mostly optimization programs. What word is most likely to come next, given the words that have just come before, given that we've read trillions of sentences and we're just doing optimization, like a probability thing. And then if they happen to go off on a tangent, then you get your hallucinations. They're good, but here's what I think. Artificial intelligence is already a bullshit name. It's artificial for sure, but what's intelligence? Wouldn't intelligence include judgment or agency or reasoning? And is AI doing that now, or is it just an incredibly rapid recombination of what's happened before? So you got to look at the hype involved there and think, call it always extremely rapid computation. Is extremely rapid computation going to help us? Yeah, it could help us if you put it to the right uses with the right constraints. Will it take over the world and decide it wants to grow strawberries everywhere and kill us all? Well, this is just bad science fiction stories, right? And we're very quick to pick up on bad science fiction stories, as I've noticed. So AI, this is what I have to say about it. And I think I'm agreeing with the AI expert Gary Marcus that it's what LLMs have hit a wall in what they can do. They're not going to get much better than they are. They are pretty damned impressive. I think actually summarization is a spooky power of the current LLMs. I'm surprised that they can do even that, because summarization is actually not an easy skill, as any writer would know. So who knows about AI, but it's not the main thing. For one thing, it's an insane energy sink. It's an insane carbon burn if you use carbon to power it. So it's kind of a toy, and it has distracted a whole lot of investment people and a whole lot of Silicon Valley people, because that's naturally their game, in thinking it's the most important game in town when actually it's climate change. And then what's happening to our American government right now? Well, it's being wrecked from the top on purpose by vandals and gangsters who thinking in terms of mafia and pirating and revenge. The revenge of a poor guy who lost an election and had a pandemic strike him down and wants revenge on all of us because of these sorry facts of his past. To have a lunatic in charge is disturbing. How did he get there in the first place after what he's done in the past? That's disturbing to contemplate. How robust is the American government when it's being attacked right from the top? We're going to find out. I think it's pretty robust because there's so many people there who actually hate what's happening and want to hold the line. But I have to admit, it's an experiment. Let's have a whole bunch of people go to Washington and then break a whole bunch of laws and fire a bunch of people and wreck a bunch of budgets and do a bunch of stuff that they aren't really allowed to do and see what happens. We're in that experiment. I'm hoping that the government will be robust, but also I've seen this myself in my own experiments in nano government, which is to say my neighborhood council. Um, things can be wrecked in 2 months that then take 5 years to repair. And for sure, we're going to see that because it's just harder to put back together things and restore things, especially against resistance, than it is to wreck things in the first place. We need a more robust response from our wonderful Democratic Party. We need information. We need every citizen to do their part as much as they can and to talk to the people that represent them in government, etc. So the trifecta is momentary, I think. And so your son is 17. It will be a different trifecta when he is 30, but climate change will still be hanging over him. The others may be dealt with or not, but they're not permanent parts of the crisis the way climate and the mass extinction event are permanent parts of the crisis.
After Jerry asks this question, I also want you just to explain to the audience what the wet bulb temperature is, because it's something you write about a lot in the first part of the book in Ministry of the Future.
Okay.
Hi, I'm very engaged with climate, and I'm a member of the State Sierra Club Committee on Climate and Energy. And I'm hearing a lot of reports about carbon removal, which lead me to believe that it's pretty much the accepted view that it's a failed technology. And from what I understood you saying tonight, you seem to think that it's a feasible technology with the right kind of politics and money behind it. So I'd be interested in hearing you say a little more about that.
Sure. Well, now recall what I said. Carbon drawdown, there's no one method that can bring down the 40 billion tons per year that we're putting up there. But all carbon drawdown methods proposed work. They just don't scale adequately. But reforestation, you grow trees, they draw down carbon, they keep it, and even when the trees die, the wood still keeps it. That draws carbon down, but okay, you would need like 2 planets worth of reforestation to take down enough carbon. Ocean, kelp beds, a lot of them out there. You grow it, you then sequester that carbon. Even direct air capture, they have successfully, for $500 a ton, sucked CO2 out of the atmosphere and drawn it down. The carbon drawdown methods work. The whole suite of them would have to be ramped up. Even Andreas Malm, who has cast doubt on this whole project in a new book that's coming out called The Long Heat, a book you have to read that will shake you to your core if you're interested in these things. Even he admits that if all of the pastures where we keep our cows and cattle that are carbon producers in themselves rather spectacularly, if we stopped eating beef and we reforested the ranches of the world, that would be a significant carbon drawdown. And then also the mineralization, the basalt and olivine, and regenerative agriculture is often spoken of as being a spectacular opportunity to drop carbon out of the atmosphere, sequester it in the soil while growing food for people. It's a double good. We have a lot of food. We have a lot of land in agriculture and in viticulture. And so if that land was drawing down carbon as we grew our food and our wine grapes, that too is a carbon drawdown method that works. So I don't think that it's right to say that these methods are somehow delegitimated or shown not to work. They do work. They just are expensive and they don't scale.
Could I follow up very briefly?
Sure.
Yeah, I think in my mind there's a big distinction between natural carbon drawdown and technological carbon drawdown. And what I was asking you to talk about the feasibility of was the technological drawdown.
Okay, thank you. I didn't understand that. And I would say direct air capture of the technological drawdown, as I said, you would need a car industry's worth of machinery So although those machines do work in Zurich and in Iceland, they're working, they absolutely don't scale to adequacy. They're too expensive, and they burn carbon to build them. So then there's this net carbon, or net energy, or energy balance. How much input of energy did you have to put into this system to get out the energy that you got? And the ratio had better be pretty good, or else it isn't useful to do it. So in terms of the technological, I would say not a failed technology, but not, how can I say it, a practical technology. And even Malm puts it this way: if you had clean energy like solar, like wind, and you were at a moment of overcapacity, and that energy is either going to go into a battery or else it's going to just be dissipated. If that energy ran a direct air capture machine and put a little bit of CO2 in the ground, it's like every ton counts, 1 ton at a time. You might as well get the overage. And this is in a book where he's casting huge skeptical doubt on the whole idea. But even there, he says that's one of the few cases where it might be a good thing to do. And you wanted me to talk about the wet bulb temperature. So this is just a heat and humidity index in combination. And what the medical community, some elements in the research community noticed about 15 years ago was when the heat and humidity get up to a certain level, then the human body can't sweat off its heat. It begins to overheat. You get hyperthermia rather than hypothermia. And hyperthermia will kill you just as fast as freezing to death. As you overheat, you have organ shutdown and you die. First, the little kids. Second, the old people. Third, people with various kinds of illnesses who are marginalized. So the wet bulb 35 temperature, it happened outside of Chicago for a few hours in 1991. In the tropics, it happens fairly frequently, not for long. And here's the point. If you didn't have air conditioning or fans, if the electricity grid went down during a wet bulb 35 event that lasted for a few days, everybody caught out in that, even if they were in the shade, even if they were naked in the shade and fanning themselves, the body is not capable of shedding the heat that you'd be taking on because of the humidity combined with the heat. We're good in desert heat, up to 130 degrees. We're bad in wet heat, and that's why people left the East Coast in the summer back before there was air conditioning. Before there was air conditioning, Washington, D.C. would just empty out in the summers because it was too humid and hot. Humid, my mom used to say this till I was driven to distraction. It's not the heat, it's the humidity. Well, yes, it's both in combination. So that's the wet bulb temperature. In India last year, during the heat wave then, there were wet bulb 35 moments on the maps, and the way that they color these weather maps, where it goes to like purple when things are really bad, from yellow to orange to red to purple. A big part of Uttar Pradesh was purple. And I was terrified. I thought, oh my God, here it is. Because when I wrote that scene, I was terrified. And I don't reread that scene. I don't listen to it. I won't read. People ask me to read it aloud in readings. I say, no, that's not appropriate. Nobody should have to read that except if they choose to. Let's put it that way. So that's the wet bulb.
In the book, you briefly mentioned Jevons paradox and that somehow it's overcome. And so I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, I don't know if it's overcome or not, but Jevons paradox or Jevons paradox, I don't know how to pronounce it, is from the late 1800s. The more efficient we are at using an energy resource, the more we use of it, not the less. So that's the paradox of it. You could say, well, we'll just make more efficient use of the oil that we burn. But no, the more efficient, the more we burn. Well, now, this is not a physical law. This is an observation that has more to do with human habits and with finance. So I don't believe ministry says that it's been overcome. I think it's more of a question. Let's put it this way. If we had enough clean energy to desalinate water, to irrigate crops, if it was all clean energy, then could you outrace Jevons paradox? And I think that's what the passage in my book luckily, I don't have to look back at that chapter as often as some others. But I think that's what that book was saying then. I'll have to go back and look at it.
Thank you. It's wonderful to hear you speak, and I've read many of your books and enjoyed them. Of course, my favorite is Ministry for the Future, but I wanted to give you a chance to end on a positive note, because my second favorite book of yours is a lot of people don't realize that you wrote a wonderful book of nonfiction, The Sierra Nevada Love Story.
Oh,
and I just wondered if you would like to say a few words about that.
Yeah. Well, I can only say thank you, thank you, thank you. My most recent book is called The High Sierra, A Love Story. So it's nonfiction. It's a combination of memoir, history, and geology of our Sierra Nevada. And my editor was very pleased at the subtitle, A Love Story, and so was I, because nonfiction books are supposed to have subtitles, right? An artistic, metaphorical, and incomprehensible main title, Mirror in the Sky. And then the subtitle explains what the hell the book is about. So mine did that. I wrote it in the early years of the pandemic. I had finished Ministry for the Future and essentially blown up my novel career by that one book. First, using up every idea I ever had left. And secondly, taking over my life and my brain in a way that no book of mine ever had before. And I don't know, my teacher, Fred Jameson, who I miss so much, who died last year, he would say, "Oh, Kim, it's not your best novel, but it is your most important novel." And so damn it. I have many a novel of mine that I'm more fond of than Ministry for the Future, which is kind of, except for the play of forms, the games, is kind of dire. Not exactly a prison novel, but it's a hard march. And certainly the first chapter I never wanted to look at again. So this Sierra book, I had been thinking about it in trail hikes for many years, perhaps 40. Oh, I should write a book about the Sierra. But there were constraints. While my parents were alive, I didn't want to talk about my youthful LSD usage. While my mountain guru was alive, I didn't want to write complaints about what a weirdo mountain guru he turned out to be. All these things changed. The pandemic came and I got to write it. It just poured out of me. Then I had to cut it in half because it really poured out of me. And shape it and have fun with it. And I think I'm very fond of it. I am a novelist. I think of my nonfiction as a kind of something that I'm both not good at and don't care about. But of course, with it being about the Sierra, that made it different. It was a love letter to our most magnificent mountain range. For walkers, the most magnificent mountain range on this planet. And so thank you for that. It was a lot of fun. I had a wonderful publisher, same publisher as my science fiction books, but a different arm of that publisher. And it was a joy. And I recommend it to you all. You will certainly learn more about me, which is not the point, but you'll learn more about the Sierra Nevada for sure.
These chairs need some WD-40.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. I didn't
Thank
see
you.
someone else. Go ahead.
So some science fiction writers have given people the idea that, we are using up this planet, we'll just move to another one. How can we get different thoughts in people's heads? Because this is our planet.
Yes. Well, I can only agree with you. And I have to admit that I am somewhat responsible. My Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars of the 1990s, was the story of us going to Mars and terraforming it and starting up a new utopian cooperative society there with the opportunity for a fresh start socially and also creating the biosphere of that planet with using earthly genomic matter to create a kind of hierarchic second Earth on Mars. Well, I think it makes a good novel. It's not a good plan. Now, one of the reasons it's not a good plan was only learned by humanity after I finished my novel, my trilogy, which, thank God, I don't know what I would have done, but I didn't know this. The surface of Mars is quite poisonous. There are perchlorates in the parts per 100 range, and we use perchlorates to like kill our thyroid if it's gone out of control, in the parts per billion range. So Mars is actually quite toxic beyond what I even knew, because of course the air is poisonous and the cosmic rays are coming in and crashing your brain to bits. Mars is not a friendly place, but no, it's the closest to being friendly of anywhere in our solar system. And I would reference to you my novel Aurora from 2015. We're not going anywhere out of this solar system. We can't get to the stars. That's a science fiction dream that turns out to be a fantasy. Why? They're too far away. And we are creatures of this planet. And the other finding that crushed what little to zero hopes I had of leaving this planet, because I would never have done any of this stuff, I tried to make it clear that it would be like moving into a Motel 6 for the rest of your life. But the gut microbiome, that's another new finding. 50% of the DNA inside your body is not human DNA. You are an ecology. We are biomes. We're like forests or swamps. And those other creatures inside us that help us be us, they're not going to like it being off the planet. They won't get their regular doses of other bacteria, of other biological microbiome. Microbiomes are created out of your environment. We are creatures of this planet. And that's something to celebrate. The whole idea of leaving was a kind of a post-war or a romantic or techno fantasy. It was a fantasy of escape, maybe of renewal, maybe, once religion died, once God went away, maybe humanity was to replace it by filling up the galaxy. And sometimes people talk about even other galaxies, which shows a remarkable unawareness of distance, per se. So I've had to just say this over and over again for the last maybe 20 years. And, I think most of humanity, the whole time that science fiction existed, they were saying, that ain't going to happen. And they were right. Sometimes skepticism about new technologies just turn out to be right. There are metabolic rifts, there are crevasses in the scenario, there are impossibilities, physical impossibilities that are being ignored. And, I would say science fiction gets to play every game it wants to if it makes a good story. So I want to defend the genre. And space opera is a story space, just like Middle Earth is a story space. So if you're zipping around the galaxy faster than light and talking to aliens that speak English, blah, blah, some really good stories can be told there. But they are relatives of Lord of the Rings. They are fantasies in disguise with a little scientific gloss put on them so that you can imagine they might happen. In the 1940s, the Great Acceleration was beginning. It wasn't clear what could happen and what couldn't. So 1940s, 1950s science fiction is particularly exuberant in ways that now we realize, well, they were feeling irrational exuberance of rockets can get us off this planet. Oh my God, we can go anywhere. And that turned out not to be true, and we know that now. So if science fiction were doing its job right, it would be doing more climate fiction, doing more Earth fiction, doing more love your mother fiction, and less, we got to go somewhere else because Earth is doomed type fiction. I hate dystopias. They're pointless. I hate post-apocalyptic fiction because the apocalypse is going to be worse than what those novels talk about. Those are fantasies of, well, we'll just gather a little bit of people out in the wilderness and we'll do fine. It's worse than that. So science fiction, I'm not responsible for all of it, and I'm very deep in that community. And I have friends who are quite crazily absorbed in passions that are not mine, and I still love them dearly. So I would defend the genre, but its effect on this culture, like the idea that AI might just suddenly take over and kill us all. You got to be able to distinguish bad science fiction from good science fiction. So everybody should be an English major.
Thank you so much, Stan. This has been just an extraordinary evening. And now he is going to be in the foyer signing his book. So, yes.
Happy to do so. And thank you very much for coming out. Thank you, Georgia, for organizing this. It's been a pleasure. I love Sonoma. Cheers.